Hi everyone, welcome to the next of our catch-up videos based on the team sessions that we ran before summer. This one is going back over Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. So if you weren't able to participate in the team sessions, or if you just want to go back over the stuff that we said, all of that information will now be here. So first things first, obviously the Charge of the Light Brigade is in itself a very famous event and was popularised by more than just Tennyson. Lots of artists did various bits of. Done a quick Google image search, find some of them here, and what you see here is this quite violent landscape, but there is this sense of heroism, of do or die glory going on, which I think reflects quite effectively a popular view of conflict at the time. It's not the only view, and it's certainly not the only view in this poem, but this is the sort of experience and attitudes, this plucky Brits fighting against all the odds, that would have been reasonably familiar to many of Tennyson's readers. So the first thing that's really important to consider is the historical context and what the blunder is. So what was the Charge of the Light Brigade? So the Battle of Balaclava, at which the Charge of the Light Brigade occurred in 1954, in the middle of the Crimean War. And this was a really significant event and was very heavily reported on. So the Light Brigade are cavalry, which means they're mounted on horseback, and they are not armed to deal with the brutal attack of cannons. So this conflict was quite a transition point. We'd think of World War I as much more reflective of modern warfare that we're more familiar with today. At this point, there was quite a lot of transition, so there was lots of new technology like cannons and things coming in that were now more mobile and could be used on the field of battle much more effectively. So a mistake was made. The cavalry misunderstood their instructions, and they rode straight into a narrow valley where they were targeted by Russian cannons. So they basically went into a kill zone. Who made the mistake and where the mistake is often up for debate, and I would encourage you to go and read a few articles and things about this to get a better sense of the reality of the situation. I don't think anyone really knows exactly what happened. At some point, the orders went wrong, or went to the wrong place, or someone gave the wrong order, and so this troop of men, this 600, who should not have gone into this valley, ended up going in there, even though they could see that it was going to be a slaughter. When you show up on a horse and you look in a valley and you can see the cannons, this isn't going to go well. And that's really that heroism in the face of death is what Tennyson is particularly celebrating in this poem. So over 150 British soldiers were killed, more than 120 were wounded, plus the poor horses. And at home, the news of the disaster was a sensation. This was all over the newspapers because this conflict was also one of the first times newspapers were able to have correspondence, proper war correspondence out there, finding out information for themselves, not just relying on what the army told them. And because of the telegraph system, were able to get information home relatively quickly to go into the newspapers. So this was another point of evolution where the public at home knew about what had happened, and the fact that there was a mistake made somewhere along the line was publicised. So Tennyson doesn't necessarily have to go into all of these details because the audience he was writing for were familiar with the events. Okay, so that's really important to be aware of. So the newspapers had various attitudes and ideas, and again, all of these are available online, and I would encourage you to spend a bit of time reading about the context of this and looking at some of this stuff, because it really does help you with your understanding of this poem. But a lot of them were very positive. They were talking about how brilliant and brave it was, the gallantry and the devotion of the soldiers. I do not think that one man flinched. The idea that everyone bravely went in and was prepared to die to follow the orders and to, for king and country, or queen and country this time. There was some criticism though. So you've got this quote here: the most disastrous in its consequences. So there was this tension happening in the discussion of this battle of celebrating the soldiers who died and who fought, but equally not being blind to the fact that they shouldn't have been there in the first place. And this was, as I say, a topic that was being discussed. It was publicly in the public conscious. So this poem, I think, when we read it decontextualized, can seem superficially to be purely patriotic, celebrating the death of these soldiers. But there is subtle criticism in there, and Tennyson only needed to put subtlety in there because it was such a big topic of discussion at the time. So we're aware of Tennyson himself. Okay, so born 1809, he was born to a big family, a religious family. His, dad was a country vicar, but he received a very good education. He was very highly educated, and in 1850 he became poet laureate. So just like Simon Armitage is our current poet laureate, and he's another one in our collection. So Tennyson was poet laureate at that time, and again that means that he is the official poet of Britain, and has to write about events that are important to the British nation, and the charge of the Light Brigade was considered one of those events. So he had and it's a political role as much as anything else. He can't just blindly criticise the government or the ruling classes. So it's generally supposed to be something that celebrates the nation, but does give them an opportunity to draw attention to the ways the British public and the British people, and in this case the British soldiers, perhaps were not served as well as they could be. Okay, so there is this little tension in his role. He's not writing just as a private writer. He's commissioned. His job is a public, somewhat political role. So the poetry he produces on affairs of the nation have more weight to them because he has an official capacity. So while at first glance it may appear to be following this sort of popular sentiment of just celebrating a heroic, the heroism and glory of their death, there is subtle condemnation in there as well, and that's where you will really be able to start to develop your analysis of this poem, is if you're aware of the subtleties and can unpick those and can link that to Tennyson's public political status and the position he was in which he wrote this poem, and his awareness that his voice would carry more weight than a private writer would carry because he was the official poet of Britain. Okay, so going through this, we're going to be looking at, from the idea of like the big ideas to help you make connections, we've got attitudes to war being looked at, and that's sort of the blue annotations. The green annotations are to do with the effects of conflict to an extent, and the red ones are the reality of conflict. But again, a lot of these do overlap. Okay, but it just helps you a little bit when you're coming to connect poems together, because you can think, oh, this other one is also about reality of conflict. I think this one pairs particularly nicely with something like Bayonet Charge, or with Remains, or with Exposure, which dwell much more on the personal impact of conflict and the reality of the conflict on a sort of one-to-one level, whereas this has this omniscient narrator who looks at things from this big picture and is talking about it in grander terms, and is generally probably a bit more positive and celebratory, even with that subtle condemnation, than the other ones, which are more overtly condemnatory of those who are making decisions. So as we're going through some key vocabulary to be able to discuss with this poem, you've got the ideas of heroism, of glory, of patriotism, and of honour. Okay, so any discussion of Light Brigade, I would think, would have to include some of those words. And when we're talking about key methods, you've got the use of repetition in here, the use of the rhythm. For those of you who are interested, and there's lots and lots written about this and on YouTube elsewhere, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This has a dactylic dimeter for the rhythm, which is one stressed syllable followed by two unstressed syllables, repeated generally twice per line in this poem. And the idea is that it kind of replicates the sound of hoofbeats or something. Personally, I find that to be one of those things that people like to learn and like to include in an essay, but don't have much to say about it. So if you have something clever to say, great. If not, find something else. The use of the verbs, particularly in this, is quite important, and the use of imperative verbs particularly, and also various images and stuff as we go through. Worth noting that Tennyson obviously wasn't there at the charge of the Light Brigade. He didn't see this battle. There was public enthusiasm for knowledge about this, but equally, just as we have today, you support the troops. So you have to be careful, and Tennyson had to be careful, that any criticism was not perceived as a criticism of the men who fought and died, that it had to be aimed at the idea that they had been badly served by someone else. We support, there's that very strong sentiment, and as I say, it still goes right through to today, that the people who are prepared to go and fight and die for your country should be supported by the public. But equally, Tennyson is showing us that that doesn't mean that the army and the institution is above criticism. So there is that subtlety and that fine line in there. Right, so we're going to go through this a stanza or two at a time. It's quite a long poem and there's quite a lot of repetition in it, so we can go through and I'll pick out the key ideas. I'm not going to read it to you. Again, you can go and find those on YouTube. So it begins with this sense of momentum. Half a league, half a league, half a league onwards. A league is a measurement of distance, old-fashioned measurement of distance. So you've got this sense of momentum straight from the start, because this is a light brigade, which means they are on horseback, so they are moving and they're moving quickly. So that sense of momentum and movement is established right from the beginning. All in the Valley of Death rode the 600. So the Valley of Death is a reference to Psalm 23 from the Bible, in which King David declares that he will not be afraid even in the valley of the shadow of death because of his faith in God. So there's this quite interesting use of that allusion there. Tennyson's audience would absolutely be familiar with that phrase. And this idea that they sort of have to hand themselves over to God. They're in the hands of God at this point because of the dangers they're going into, but equally that image of the valley of death, of almost like death owning this valley. You'll note that death is capitalised there, it's a proper noun in this case, and the sense of death possessing this valley that they're riding into. They're riding willingly into death, and if some of them get out again, that's for God to decide, but it's almost as if they hand themselves over to a higher power. And so it's emphasising perhaps their own powerlessness, and also their bravery, that they are going into it knowing that this is the valley of death they are entering into. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. So there is this omniscient narrator here, this sense of someone observing the battle who apparently is privy to this. Again, obviously a lot of these details are somewhat imagined, and they are based on reports that were coming back from people who were there. But it's all very depersonalised, he said. So there's no one person singled out. It's this, the unit did very well. So forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the Valley of Death rode the 600. So there's this sense of heroism and glorification coming through. No one, there's no coward. All 600 rode into the Valley of Death, and they're charging forward. There's this powerful use of those imperative verbs there to give that sense of momentum and that sense of no one hesitating or anything like that, and also that sense that death is a part of war, but they ride bravely towards it. So any professional soldier knows that there is a risk to their lives, and these guys are going, right, this is our time, but this is our duty that we must do. So they're demonstrating those patriotic values. So we then move into the second stanza, and this is obviously a very formally arranged poem with these very clear stanzas. So we get that repetition of forward the Light Brigade, continuing that sense of momentum. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. So they're all courageous, and that use of that rhetorical question there is quite effective, because it says, was there a man dismayed? No! So that it shows they're all courageous, doing their duty, even though they may not like the order, they know that it's their duty to follow it, so they do. And it's saying there that even each individual soldier knew someone had blundered, so they knew they were going into a mistake. So there's that little criticism in the faith in the system, and that sense that there was a human error somewhere that then makes the subsequent heroic deaths where they lay down their lives, even though they know they shouldn't be there, someone's fault, and it gives that sense of it being needless. And I think that's quite an interesting idea, because it creates that sense that someone is responsible for the deaths of these heroic men who shouldn't have been there and shouldn't have gone in. But then you equally get to a point, particularly I think for more modern readers, where we're going, well, if they all know it's stupid and they shouldn't go in, why are they going in there? So it does still have that case of reinforcing that you do your duty, you follow orders. Follow, as exemplified by these next few lines. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. So it's not their job to go, this is stupid. It's not their job to question orders or to try and ask for the reasons. Their job is to do as they have been told and die if necessary. Orders must be followed. And how we feel about that, I think, is quite interesting, because again, when you compare it to, say, bayonet charge, where you have this focus on this one man who's clearly scared out of his mind, we're distanced from these individual soldiers, and it's therefore perhaps a little harder to feel that individual pathos for them. And so instead we can focus on this sort of celebration of the glory rather than focusing on the individuals who were lost. And we get again that repetition of into the valley of death rode the 600. So the repetition is really effective, gives us that sense of momentum, but also keeps us focused on the inevitability of the deaths that are going to come, because they are still riding into this valley. And then we get to this really quite famous bit that creates this sense of imagery and the sort of almost excitement that the constant structure and that constant rhythm helps to create. So cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. So you get that sense of them being trapped and surrounded. They are going into this horrific situation, but they're not dismayed. And that sense of the cannons, these are men on horseback with swords. This is not an equal fight. And so the power imbalance there is quite interesting. And again, I think that works quite nicely with something like Remains, where you have the one soldier who has this power, has this machine gun, is able to kill this guy from a distance to the point where he's turned almost inside out. But he lives yet feels like he's lost. And here instead you have these guys who go in knowing that there's a good chance they're going to die, but they go in regardless, fighting, and in the valley, in the face of death, are happy to face that down. And that sense of the different power balances of the underdog is quite interesting. And then you get this use of these really powerful words: volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Creates a sense of noise and confusion. They're surrounded, there's noises everywhere, it's thundering, so it sounds almost like a big storm going off with all these cannons blasting. They're thundered, they're stormed at, so it sounds dangerous and panicky and confused, but boldly they rode and well. So even in all of that, it's celebrating their nerve with that word. Boldly they rode and well. So it's going, doesn't matter, it's all this horrible stuff that normal people, me and you, wouldn't be able to cope with, but they can go for it. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. So despite their surroundings, they can still be brave. They're going into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell. So you get this imagery of being eaten or consumed, waiting by mouth that's waiting to be fed. And I like the way that death and hell are almost made synonymous here for the purposes of this poem. And this hellish landscape that they're riding into, because there'd be smoke everywhere and flashes, or almost like the fiery pit that they're going down into, and even that imagery of descending. But they're brave enough to face hell itself if that is their job, if that's their duty, even though they shouldn't be there, because someone has blundered, has made a mistake that has sent them in there. So you get that really celebration of their sacrifice, at the same time as reinforcing the futility of it and the frustration that these brave, heroic men are wasting their lives following orders, doing their job, because someone else didn't do their job properly. They are suffering. So we then move on to stanzas 4 and 5, where you've got flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air. So you've got this positive light imagery, but it's also quite brief. So their sabres like their swords. And we've got that reminder that it's swords versus cannons, which shows the ineptitude of the fight. But they're the little flashes of light in this fiery pit that they've rode down into. And sabring the gunners there. So that idea that they're going after the people who are lighting the cannons to try and protect the people behind them. So that sense of, every man is responsible for everyone else. Charging an army while all the world wondered. So there's 600 of them, and apparently they're charging an army. So again, you get that sense of celebrating the underdog. And all the world wondered. So the world apparently is amazed watching these guys. So it's like leading by example, celebrating their amazing heroism and courage. Plunged in the battery smoke right through the line they broke. So again, those sorts of verbs like plunged, so that sort of sense of depth, but also intention going in, but also the idea that they're almost like lost or obscure, because the battery smoke is all of the smoke that's created by the cannons going off. So they're being sort of lost or obscured. They're plunging in and out of this hellish landscape, but they're also diving straight in there, right through the line they broke. Partly probably because no one was expecting a load of men on horses to try and charge a load of cannons. There'll have been a bit of shock. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. So that shattered and sundered is quite a nice contrast to in the previous stanza where they were being volleyed and thundered by the cannons, but now the opposition are shattered and sundered. So they're like split apart and broken. And think about that word shatter. There's like an permanence to that. They've like absolutely broken it. So there's some sense of victory. The alliteration there draws attention to those lines. So that sense that it wasn't totally futile. They did manage something. They achieved something in there. They managed to break through the enemy lines. And the sense that even in the face of these cannons and being outnumbered and outmatched, they still made the enemy reel from the sabre stroke, because they are such impressive soldiers. Then they rode back, but not the 600. And then you get that wonderful sense of loss integrated into that sense of victory. Tennyson then shifts the tone slightly. Then they rode back, but not the 600. So that's changing from that established refrain, because up to this point it was rode the 600, rode the 600. Now it's finished, not the 600 come back. So that sense of the loss and death is implicit there. But again, remember, everyone reading this would also have been very familiar with the events of what actually happened here. And it's drawing attention to the sense of loss without having to make a massive deal out of it. It's there. So Tennyson doesn't gloss over the fact of the death. To him, that's part of what makes this heroic, is because they went in all prepared to die, even though they should never have been there in the first place. So then we get into stanza 5, which is obviously a very direct echo to stanza 3. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered. So here, because they're coming back, the cannons are now behind them rather than in front of them. But it also, by repeating the scenario, how they were surrounded, it gives you that sense that almost they were overwhelmed. It emphasises the inequality of the fight and does have that sense of a veiled critique, therefore, of the people who sent them in there. Because what on earth are they doing there, surrounded by all these cannons? Okay, we shouldn't be wasting our men like that, is kind of the attitude that comes through. Stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. So now these are heroes. Okay, in stanza 2, it was there a man dismayed? They were men. Now they've gone through this, they're now heroes. And some of them are dying a heroic death. And that's therefore, again, that sense of the waste of that death through the blunder. Okay, they should never have been there. There was no point to them being there. And therefore, while they're dying a heroic death, these are men who could have perhaps contributed more to the country, to the war effort, if they hadn't been sent there by mistake. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of hell, back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them, left of 600. So the ones who were left get back through. The ones that had fought really well, who had come through the jaws of death, come back from the mouth of hell. So there's almost a sense of surprise. They've defeated death. as far as this poem is concerned, which is quite celebratory, but also that sense of death is the one great known, it's the great constant, everyone dies. And so they've come through the jaws of death for now. But then you get that little sense of all that was left of them, left of 600. So again, you've got that sense of waste and the criticism of coming through of those in charge. But also there's a little bit of ambiguity there. What is left of these men? Are they whole? As we saw in the context, there was a lot of injuries from this as well. So how many are injured? How many may die later? So that all that was left of them has that sense of a bigger loss than just the men who had died on that battlefield. And then we get to this final stanza, which has a slight shift. So he's told the story, the narrative is done, and now he focuses instead on almost like a call to the reader for their job in this. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. So that use that rhetorical question at the beginning gives us a challenge that we are responsible for preventing their glory from fading. They must be honoured, they must be remembered, which actually has worked quite well, because you guys are here in 2020 reading this poem, learning about these men who made this sacrifice. So Tennyson did a good job there, to be fair. And we get these imperative instructions given to the reader. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. So it is a direct instruction, a call to his readers to not forget their actions and their sacrifice, but that we now have a job as well. If we're going to live up to the example they set, we must honour them. And we are given that responsibility, that duty. And again, remember, as Tennyson is the poet laureate, his words carry some weight. It speaks for the ruling sort of the rulers of the country, and he's standing there saying, this is our job, this is the job. If you are a patriotic subject of this country, your job is to honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade. But it is also ambiguous, because how are we supposed to honour them? So there is that little open to interpretation thing there. Is honouring them, celebrating them wholeheartedly, is it always cheering the troops no matter what, or is it actually making sure that this sort of waste and sacrifice doesn't happen again? Is honouring them, does that mean making sure that no one else has to suffer needlessly as they did, but instead protecting our soldiers so that they can do their duty properly and support the country, rather than needlessly giving up their lives because someone blundered, because someone made a mistake? So that little subtleties all the way through Charge of the Light Brigade, I think, is often where you can really get some interesting stuff from. And again, always think about how the poem ends. This ends with a call to the readers to take some action, but it is ambiguous in what that action is. And that, I think, is a particularly interesting way of exploring that. Tennyson is using his power as the poet laureate to try and get that message out there, but how we interpret that is down to the individual. Okay.